Thanks, Nikos, and I'd like to thank everybody who's behind the DTL project and for funding this proposal. I'm going to talk about exposing demographic biases of news publishers and promoters on social media. This is joint work with a couple of researchers from Indian Institute of Technology, Kharagpur. I'll try to keep it short. In some sense, one of the ways I like to think of as a researcher is plan for both sorts of scenarios. So, for instance, we have some projects where we try to expose how much data sites like Facebook and Twitter are gathering about people in the hope of decreasing the data gathering. But imagine an alternate scenario where suppose none of them were effective and we actually end up having Facebook and Twitter gathering a ton of data about us. Can we then use that data to make something else transparent, sort of a thing? So this project is somewhat motivated by that kind of a thinking. So as many of you know, the landscape for news media is changing very rapidly. Traditionally, there were a small number of big media houses that would more or less dominate the entire news dissemination business. Whereas these days with social media, you have literally tens of thousands, if not millions of people who are participating in the whole business of both generating and distributing news. There are some statistics that Pew study has shown that in 2017, there is a fair fraction of US adults who got their news from social media. Now, here's what I see as a fundamental problem with social media news, which is you have a page like this, breaking news, and it has as you can see, there are a number of different followers of this news media site. It's on Facebook. And then they make a number of posts, and there are lots of other people who participate in disseminating the post. Now, the problem is we don't really know who this publisher is, oftentimes, and we don't know who are the people behind sharing of these news stories with others. When you traditionally watch news on TV or radio or hear it on radio or read it on a newspaper, we often can contextualize the news because at least many of the informed people kind of know the biases of the publisher of the news. For instance, if I was reading a New York Times newspaper versus Wall Street Journal, I kind of know that New York Times tends to lean left in its ideology, and whereas Wall Street Journal tends to lean more towards the right in terms of its ideology. But whereas in social media, it's like anybody can publish news and anybody can spread it. So just to give you some statistics for how the number of publishers are mushrooming on Facebook, we did some data gathering using the Facebook ad API or marketing API. And what we found was that with very little effort, we could identify at least 22,000, more than 22,000 Facebook pages that are related to news. These are all Facebook pages that have signed up as news media publishers. And of course, this is worldwide. Now, the reason why we wanted to understand the bias in social media news is because there is increasingly concerns about fake news propagation, extreme opinions being expressed, and then conspiracy theories floating around as well. In fact, I would highly encourage you guys to read this article in case if you haven't in Rolling Stone, which is titled as Anatomy of a Fake News Scandal. This is about how before the US elections, there were some really strange rumors that got spread, and they all started with some Facebook posts and other people spreading it on top of it. Now, as I mentioned before, this wasn't that bias in media has always been a problem, but at least in the traditional news media, the bias was very transparent. And this is because we had decades of research by journalism scholars who studied the kind of biases that different media publishers have. Now, the problem with detecting bias in social media is that it doesn't scale. So there are no easy ways to monitor biases of news publishers or promoters in social media. That brings us to the central challenge that we wanted to tackle, which is how to quantify the biases of news publishers at scale. So here is a very simple insight. And our insight is that on many of these social media sites, the media sites already have an estimate of who the audiences are. And so why don't we look at the demographics of the audience of these news media sites to see if we can infer the bias. Now notice that essentially this is a strong claim, because what in an ideal world you would want to understand is the bias of the content that is being published by the news media sites, or but what we are actually suggesting is to look at the bias of the audience who are following the news media site. And our hope is that in the real world, both these kinds of biases end up correlating quite well. Let me just show you a few statistics for this. So this is the demographics of all Facebook users in the US. And what I'm showing here is a pie chart with their political leanings. As you can see, there are about a third of them are conservative, a little over 40 are liberal or very liberal, and there are about 25% of people who are moderate. Okay, so this is the demographics of all Facebook users. Now, when we look at the demographics or the political leanings of people who read New York Times or who are interested in New York Times Facebook page, you actually notice that the demographics are actually more or less at about the same as for all US users. So for instance, there is about 30% of the people who read New York Times who are conservative, and about 29% who are moderate, and so on. Now, if you look at the same thing for Fox News, on the other hand, you start noticing that actually the percentage of conservatives followers increases to 50%. So you could kind of get a feel for where the news media site might be leaning. Now, how many of you have heard about Breitbart? Okay, I guess many of the people who are in the US might have heard about it. Breitbart is this very influential news media site in the age of Trump. So here are the demographics of news audience for Breitbart. Basically, 90% of the followers or people who are interested in Breitbart Facebook page are conservatives. So just by looking at this high-level statistics about the demographics of people who are interested in the media site, you can immediately get a feel for it without even actually looking much more closely about the content or studying in a much more deeper level about the publisher or the intent of the publisher themselves. So the key idea is to identify publisher bias by looking at the biases in the demographics. Now, how do we compute the bias in the demographics? Well, we plan to do what I just showed, which is we plan to look at the deviation of the audience demographics from the overall demographics of the users in the social media. Now, of course, because news media is often a local business, when you're trying to do this for news media publishers in a specific country, you would want to compare with the demographics of the people in that particular country. Now, one of the interesting things with these looking at demographic dimensions is that on Facebook or on Twitter, you can actually, because they gather a lot of data about a lot of users, we can actually look at the demographic, numerous different types of demographic dimensions beyond political leaning. So for instance, we could look at the racial demographics, we could look at the age demographics, gender demographics, income level demographics, and so on. Now, how do we get all these things? Well, as Alan has explained so beautifully before, we could actually use the Facebook audience, API to actually reveal the demographic composition. Now, on Twitter, it is, we could do something similar, but there are also other techniques that we're developing to do this. Now, let me just quickly walk you through a few of these, a few more data points to show how actually looking at a publisher demographics from various different dimensions can actually lead to new insights. So let's go back to Breitbart, and let me just ask a question. If I were to ask you to guess whether Breitbart audience whether there would be a gender bias, what would you think?
Yeah.
Like clearly there is a political bias. Would you expect it to be to have a big gender bias as well? So we were expecting to see a gender bias because we thought more extreme right-leaning people would be men more than women. Turns out we were wrong. Actually, in terms of Breitbart, there's actually very low gender bias. Both men and women, there is a sizable, it's not that there is zero gender bias, but there is a fair fraction of women who are also interested in following Breitbart. What about race? In race, there is a huge bias again. So as you can see, pretty much there's a big, Caucasians are the ones who actually follow Breitbart much more than other groups. Then the even more interesting thing is the age. And age is pretty shocking. It may be difficult to read this here, but actually, if you look at Facebook, only less than 20% of people on Facebook are actually aged 55 and above. Whereas when it comes to Breitbart, they're like 60% of all the followers. So it's majority old people who are actually a tiny fraction of people on Facebook that actually end up following Breitbart. Now, the other thing that surprised us was when we looked at educational bias, there was none. So it was whether people were both well-educated people as well as high school educated people as well as people with college degrees were following Breitbart. Understandably, they have a huge expat versus native bias. Breitbart's one of the things is about it plays quite a bit to the nativist aspirations in the US. And then when we looked at income bias, again, we saw none of it. And then finally, when we looked at the relationship status bias, again, there was a significant one. Married people tend to follow Breitbart a lot more than single people. Now, of course, part of this might have been just that if you have older people who are following Breitbart, there may be some correlations that might be kicking in this process as well. So my higher level point is by just looking at these different dimensions, you start getting a much richer feel for the kind of people this media site, Breitbart, is actually appealing to. It's appealing to older white people, and actually, surprisingly, there is less of gender bias or income bias in terms of the news or the ideology that it espouses that people are interested in. So we did a similar thing for Twitter. So this one is actually a very different graph where what we tried to look at was, how much time do I have? 2 minutes. 2 minutes, OK. What we tried to do here is, up until now, I talked about biases of news publishers. And then we wanted to understand the biases of news stories. And in this particular case, what we wanted to look at was when there was this unfortunate incident in the US where there was a shooting at a rally for Black Lives Matter on the 7th and 8th of July 2016. So people during the rally and after started posting a number of different news articles about it. And then there were different hashtags that became trending and that were recommended to the rest of the world. But then when you look at the people who are behind these hashtags and what are the demographics of the people who are promoting these hashtags, they're pretty stark differences. So for instance, the hashtag Black Lives Matter has 57% of the promoters who are African Americans, whereas for the hashtag Police Lives Matter, the demographics were completely different. So the high order point is that to expose the biases in both news publishers as well as individual news stories by looking at their demographics. So we built, to date, 2 apps. You can actually check them out. The first one is, these are still alpha versions, so the URLs themselves are bizarrely labeled. The first one about news media bias is actually a Facebook-based thing and not a Twitter-based thing. And the second one actually shows for trends on Twitter, who are the people who are promoting it. And of course, there's a lot of ongoing work that we're still working on, both in terms of building these tools, as well as trying to improve our techniques in terms of how we detect these biases. With that, I'll be happy to take any questions.
A couple of quick questions. We are off time. We're going to take 10 minutes out of the lunch to give you the video for the last grant, so please be quick, and we can discuss during the lunch break. Questions?
How do you plan to confirm the bias that the content has with the one that the audience has? Because yes, it's a nice proxy, but you need to also confirm it, right?
Yes. So we are actually conducting a user study to decide exactly on that. So what we're looking at is we're looking at the news stories that are being published by these articles. And we're getting human annotators for how biased they are and to check whether, to what extent they correlate. Now, the one point that I would like to make here is that there is a distinction. So when Breitbart publishes a news story, there are some groups of people who promote that specific story. Now, the demographics of the group that promotes a specific story changes. So for instance, even Breitbart occasionally puts up some stories that are liked by people across both the political spectrum. So actually, the bias would actually change per story by story. So there, we're trying to confirm that the bias of the people who are promoting, the demographic biases of the people who are promoting the story actually matches with the leaning of the story. The overall audience would actually capture the overall bias of the publisher, and not just of any individual story that they're publishing. And even that, we're checking with some, at least in some cases where we have, for the traditional media sites, they also have presence on social media. And when we looked at the inferred biases of the traditional media sites, and we looked at the audience biases that we inferred, they were actually amazingly close.
Can I ask a follow-up? Or, well, I guess for fake news, I don't know if you were planning to check anything.
Yes, so the plan is to actually look at fake news and the demographics of people who are actually publishing and promoting fake news. We have some preliminary results that seem to indicate that when there are some highly polarizing rumors that get sent out, you usually see audience predominantly with one political leaning promoting it, with the other side actually either not promoting it or actually replying to it, attacking the story kind of thing. So some of these things also come out when you start looking at those statistics.